Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Judy and I love history, travel, and finding out how other people live. Today we're going to visit the Valley of the Temples, located near modern Agrigento on the southwestern coast of Sicily. The valley sits on a ridge overlooking the sea, and it was clearly established to be militarily defensible. Eventually, the inhabitants had to give up the area and withdrew somewhat further uphill and inland to a place of greater safety, which is now the modern city. Let's take a walk today at this fascinating site layered with local, Greek, Carthaginian, Roman, and eventually Sicilian history today on The Armchair Traveler. The tiny green dots you see on this Google Earth image are actually trees. This once was a busy and bustling city, perhaps housing as many as 20,000 inhabitants. It was well defended with a city wall and 9 gates. It sat above a major port, but abandonment and centuries not just of neglect, but active destruction by mining the buildings for building material, that relatively little remains to be seen. Even so, there's more than enough to slake the thirst of all but the most expert and informed visitor. The massive and still impressive temples and their foundations can still be seen, including the foundation platforms, which would have been impossible to remove. The builders designed this place to impress and overawe, as well as to be defensible. I was lucky enough to draw an honest-to-goodness archaeologist who was moonlighting as a guide. He told us a lot more about the area, and I truly wish I had had the nerve to turn on the recording function on my cell phone. Fortunately, I take excellent written notes. None of the Greek or Roman era city is visible today. Lemon and other trees grow here and animals graze, but that's about all. The area was subject to waves of settlement, with each new group of inhabitants building on top of the previous one. Modern Italian architects have mapped a great deal of the city, and they have some idea of the general size and shape, although they can only identify one temple with any certainty. When the Roman Empire fell and the Romans withdrew, the city was no longer able to defend itself. The inhabitants drew landward and uphill to a second, more easily defined ridge. Perhaps one day funds for more exploration will become available. Visitors to Sicily generally have to choose between the eastern and western halves of the island. Each half is attractive, alluring, fascinating even, and in the middle is Piazza Armerina and the famous Villa Romana de Casale, which we visited previously. I really didn't want to choose because I was not at all sure I would ever make it back, and I did manage to see a reasonable chunk of the island by setting up 2 home bases, the first in Catania, the second in Palermo. I managed all my eastern visits except climbing Mount Etna, which required a tour on my own, using a combination of foot, bus, and train travel. I opted for a 12-hour excursion from Palermo, which included both Agrigento and the Villa Romana Casale, which we visited earlier. Armchair was built on this site to command a view of the sea and to protect its hinterland, as you can see on this map. This was a big city in its day, boasting perhaps 20,000 residents. The blue lines you can see here were rivers and streams emptying out into the sea. Any invader would either have hiked uphill to the ridge or paddled upstream just to get to the rather impressive city walls shown outlined in red. This image gives you some insight into the ground and the terrain around the area. You can see that it is quite stony. The footprints of now vanished structures are still clearly visible along this particular walkway. An enormous amount of labor must have gone into leveling and creating space for the temples. This was a huge investment of time, money, and labor, and like most landholders, the Greeks took serious steps to protect it. A small portion of the city walls overlooking the sea still remain for us to examine. The area here once would have been filled with a plaza, paving stones, shops, and many other decorations, things like statues. The walls themselves were likely considerably taller than what remains today and would have provided a formidable obstacle to anyone intent on trying to conquer the city. This is a picture of my tour guide, Marco, a real enthusiast. His English was excellent, as was his knowledge of the site. I believe he might have lived in the United Kingdom for a while, teaching Italian, but now mostly seems to make a living, at least during the tourist season, as a guide here at the site. The hollow opening behind him is what remains of a tomb, although it's missing, of course, both its contents and the slab that would have covered it. Marco explained that he thought these tombs had been ransacked a long time ago, possibly for their contents, but more likely just for those slabs. The blue rectangle I've added shows you where the slab would have fit. Although archaeologists are pretty certain these were tombs, I haven't read any other explanation, although I'm sure they must exist. No one really knows when they were added to the walls. Did the Greeks do it themselves? I think that's quite possible, although the details, if correct, might change ideas on how the city was laid out initially. History tells us that the Greeks believed when a person died, his or her soul left the body behind. The Greeks don't appear to have believed their dead would have needed any earthly possessions in the next life. They didn't bother or waste the economic value of any valuable products or jewelry. Later tomb robbers, however, might have thought there was something inside that was worth stealing, but I don't believe there was. Something that was left behind was worth stealing, and that was those huge stone slabs, chiseled out of native rock and chipped into fine, flat pieces of stone, ready to be used elsewhere. Some scholars suggest that the tombs might have dated from the Roman period, although that would have been most unlike the Romans as I know them. They generally did not bury their dead inside the city, mostly for sanitary reasons. The nature of these tombs is still a mystery, left to be untangled by people with far more knowledge than I possess. What you see here, a nice flat area surrounded by a small part of the city walls, is currently labeled as the Greek city's Agora, and later on the Roman Forum. Modern archaeologists are still trying to untangle the layout of the city, sometimes using ancient references. Cicero was a wealthy Roman member of the equestrian class, jurist, travel, and writer. He actually did travel to Sicily, although whether he made it here or not would be subject to dispute. He did mention in one of his books that the Temple of Heracles, or Hercules, wasn't far from the Forum. Livy, another Roman writer, said that the Roman army arrived at the Forum right after entering through the main or Golden Gate. If you string those two references together, you might decide that this nice flat area must be a key and only candidate where the Greeks would have built their agora, and which perhaps the tidy and thrifty Romans repurposed and renamed as their forums. Who knows? They might be right, they might be completely wrong. This gorgeously draped statue, minus his head and arms, which were all too easily damaged, was partially repaired and placed in the Agora area, although its provenance wasn't explained to me. I believe it's a Roman figure. The draped clothing in this case was a toga, and the cylindrical box at the statue's left foot was called a capsa. This was a rich Roman, possibly an author. A capsa was a Roman furnishing designed to hold and sometimes to carry scrolls. We have no idea who this worthy might have been, although it was almost certainly a man. The head of this figure likely was knocked off by accident, but it could have happened in part because the Romans had a habit of saving money on sculpture by making detachable heads, the easier to update when the person who was originally pictured was disgraced and a new person was deemed worthy of a statue. I mentioned earlier that although we can see the remains, sometimes quite substantial, mostly we don't know exactly what each building had been or its name. This is the one temple whose name and dedication we're pretty sure of. The temple of Olympian Zeus was never completed and now lies in ruins. There are speculative diagrams to show what the original enormous building should have looked like. I've reproduced one on the left in this image. During one of the innumerable wars on the island, a confederation, including Agrigento, representing the Greeks, came up against the Carthaginians. The Greeks won the Battle of Himera in 480 BCE and captured the Carthaginian army. They then proceeded to build a temple to commemorate the victory. They used the captured Carthaginians as slave labor, going so far as to demean them by using figures of them to hold up the facade of the building. Some 6 decades later, the Carthaginians made another run at the Greeks, and this time the outcome was different. The roof was already gone, but one theory has it that the Carthaginians took offense, after they captured the city, at seeing their countrymen so degraded. They probably would have done a great deal of damage to whatever was left of the temple. We also know that there was an earthquake that likely toppled whatever remained. In the 18th century, whatever else was left over was quarried extensively to provide building materials for the modern town of Agrigento. Today, it survives only as a broad stone platform heaped with tumbled pillars and blocks and stone. Nearby, and more obvious, are some statues of giants which are called telamons. This pile of rocks is meant to represent the figure of a captured Carthaginian soldier who had been reduced to slave labor and was forced to help build the Temple of Zeus. In architecture, the piece is called a telemon. It's a Greek word that just means an architectural element. Most of the time, but not always, a telemon takes the form of a column or a half column. In this case, the locals decided to celebrate their victory over the Carthaginians. From the point of view of the winners in the follow-up encounter, those telemons were a real insult and one which probably enraged them. It was this boastful exposition that initially led to the destruction of the temple when the Carthaginians returned and conquered the city. This temple goes by the name of the Temple of Hera, but in truth no one really knows who it celebrated. In the Greek telling of mythology, Hera was the much put-upon wife of Zeus. Her Roman equivalent would have been Juno. Our guide told us that the temple goes by both names, but each of them is probably wrong. What we do know is that construction probably began around 450 BCE, between when the Greeks beat and enslaved the Carthaginians at the Battle of Himera and when the Carthaginians dished out their comeuppance in the siege of Agrigento. Part of the dating comes from the fact that there are signs of a fire, which probably would have occurred during that siege in 406 BCE. The temple was restored later on during the time of Roman control of the province of Sicily, and the Romans must have thought well of whoever it honored. Originally, the roof of the temple was probably terracotta tiles, but that was replaced by much more expensive marble. The temple actually remained in use until the 4th or 5th century AD, but it would have been closed during the persecution of the pagans in the late Roman Empire. The Temple of Concord is one of the best preserved Doric order Greek temples on the planet, and certainly the best I've ever seen outside of Greece. Experts will tell you that the Parthenon is better preserved and even prettier, but that's mostly because it's made out of marble rather than the much rougher sandstone we see here. Also, an immense amount of work has gone into restoring the Parthenon over many centuries. I'm sure this one would look just as impressive and possibly nicer were some overambitious restorer to plaster the columns and repaint it to look as it was originally designed to look. One reason the temples stand up as well as they have and are still recognizable is that the center portion was generally only an empty hall, normally with a statue of whatever deity to which the temple was dedicated. What wouldn't last would be the roofs. They were made of wood and either burned away during the battles and sieges and invasions or just rotted away from old age. Like the Temple of Hera nearby, the builders had to construct a flat base first, which you can see in this image. Archaeologists have yet to learn to what Greek god or goddess it was originally dedicated. The name we use now refers to the Roman goddess of harmony, but that probably wasn't the original name, which has long been lost. Somewhere along the line, some traveler found a Roman-era Latin inscription that said harmony. They unearthed it and they applied it here. Sometimes I point my camera in the direction of something that just strikes me as odd. I took a lot of pictures at the Temple of Concord, as well as 2 of this thing. I didn't see any label on it, and my otherwise gregarious and quite informed guide didn't even mention it. I later read that this is a broken piece of a statue of Icarus, which was done by a Polish artist named Igor Mitraj. It was a part of an exhibition of 17 statues by the artist that took place here in 2011. By the 1920s, almost no sign of the prior glory of this place remained standing. All of the buildings had tumbled over, either during earthquakes or had been destroyed in endless wars that plagued the island. What was left remained in the form of potential building stone, already cut, shaped, and free for the taking. In the 1920s, however, an Englishman fell in love with the place, bought an existing house called the Villa Aurea, and paid to have the temples at least partially restored. The Villa Aurea actually dates to the 19th century. It's now a bed and breakfast, but the English owner was a man named William Hardcastle. He financed some of the early excavations and restorations here in the valley. Hardcastle was a former soldier who had served with the Royal Engineers in the Boer War and was interested in archaeology. He thought that he could find the remains of an enormous theater and other infrastructure that survived on the site. The odds against him were quite long. Agrigento had been tumbled by earthquakes, sacked by the Carthaginians, and plundered for its stone. Hardcastle did restore the area, partly rebuilding the temples, uncovering the perimeter walls, and clearing some ancient roads, but he found no trace of that legendary theater. He financed the reconstruction of the 8 columns of the Temple of Heracles, which we already saw, but he kept looking for things besides the temples, and he never found them. The people in Agrigento actually liked him and made him an honorary citizen. Sadly, he lived long enough to lose all his money in the Great Depression, and although he tried, he was never able to sell this site to anybody who would preserve it. He died in poverty in a mental asylum in the town in 1933. The entire valley of the temple sits on a ridge overlooking the sea. It was built here because it was militarily defensible. The geology hasn't changed any, and the area was still desirable as a defensive site during World War II. This is a World War II era machine gun bunker which overlooked the road running near the valley of the temples. I took this photograph from very close to the Villa Aurea to show you how rocky and uneven the site is. Massive effort must have gone into leveling the spaces to make them big enough and flat enough to build the temples. I left the Valley of the Temples exhausted, but I would have liked to have seen more. The park is very large, and much of it remains to be uncovered and documented. Fortunately, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so it is unlikely to be auctioned off for vacation homes overlooking the sea. I hope to come back here one day. Thank you for exploring a small part of the Valley of the Temples on a very sunny day in Sicily with me. Come back for another walking tour next time on The Armchair Traveler.